Today we have Florian Czech and Astrid Mager here. I'll come back to you guys. Welcome. Nice to see you. But before we talk about you, I just give a very brief introduction to the topic. So again, it's all about digital transformation, and of course we see algorithmic decision making on the rise everywhere, and especially in work-related contexts such as the labor market, as well as human resources, for example, and here also in the public sector. And there are high hopes, of course, like probably you've heard also in the other sessions of this lecture series, that new opportunities will arise for evidence-based decision making. On the one hand, to avoid human errors, but also to optimally process the masses of information that we have to deal with. So I guess a lot has been said already about algorithmic decision support systems or automated decision-making processes, ADMs as they are called in this course of the lecture series. So I would totally refrain from going into more details or definitions here. But in the public sector, such systems are used for a lot of reasons, and it's really, really important to have a special attention to what is needed, but what also is done there. And so those systems, the ADMs, are used for many purposes, right? So they are performing risk analysis, they are tracing tax or welfare fraud, they grade pupils. If you remember the UK A-level grading fiasco last year, they optimize energy consumption, but they also, for example, distribute vaccination doses and many, many more. So a lot of these systems are already in place and work more or less good. And some of these algorithmic systems include machine learning or other artificial intelligence components, but many of them are just very complex sets of instructions based on either historic or, for example, experiential evidence, right? So not in all algorithms there is artificial intelligence. That's also important not to forget. So, but what is pretty clear by now, I guess, is for you guys is that these algorithmic systems are far from being neutral pieces of technology that simply support human decision making and yet could replace the fallible human being, right? So instead, and here I'm following the famous STS quote, technology is frozen politics. Instead, they reflect the many preferences, contexts, priorities, and also prejudices of the people that built them, of the data and the infrastructure that they are relying on, and on the skills and knowledge of the people that use them, right? But on the other hand, with knowing all these problems and issues, with the digital transformation and the increased datafication, we're also drowning in data. We need this kind of automated support, and especially in the public sector. We need such systems to handle the masses of information and still be able to offer the necessary services. So here the question is much more, how do we then ensure that such systems do not undermine the general principles and value systems that we want to uphold? And how can they serve the common good and not instead be used to abuse the power? And of course, there is a lot in between in this continuum. And this is what probably we are going to discuss after the lecture. So the interesting question also for me as an STS scholar is, of course, how can we study such systems? How can we learn about their incorporated frozen politics, right? And what can be done to change discrimination or other injustice based on our studies of such systems, right? And today we have two experts here to answer these questions. It's great to have you. Two experts who study the so-called AMS algorithm, a semi-automated decision-making systems developed by the Public Employment Service in Austria that has been controversially discussed in the public domain over the last years. And so here you are. I therefore warmly welcome again Astrid and Florian.
So Florian and I are sort of representatives of a team of 5 people altogether. And you will see the pictures later. So we represent also sort of the social and the technical analysis of the system. So I'm a social scientist, as Katja said, and Florian is from informatics, and that was sort of also the goal to have this interdisciplinary collaboration in order to really see how the two aspects go together. So that's the main purpose of this project, to really show that the social is in the technical already and vice versa. So the presentation we are giving today is rooted in a larger research project that was funded by the Chamber of Labor Upper Austria. So we did a larger analysis of the system from 2019 to 2020. And it was also partly funded by the Institute of Technology Assessment and the Technical University of Vienna. It is also rooted in an article that we wrote together as part of the special issue that Katja edited, Frontiers in Big Data, and sort of that are the resources we are drawing from today. To give you a bigger picture at the beginning, so Austria is not the only country that tries to roll out or that already has rolled out such a system. Countries like the Netherlands or Poland, Switzerland, Germany, Denmark, and Sweden did the same. And these systems are partly similar, but partly also very different. In Sweden, for example, there is a greater emphasis on the solidarity aspect compared to the efficiency aspect, as we will see that was very relevant in the development of this Austrian system. And in Poland, which had a pretty similar system, the database decision support system was abandoned already again, because it was not useful in practice. So we have all kinds of similar and different systems all over Europe here. The Austrian system, so while we were analyzing the system, it was already rolled out as a testing system in various testing regions in Austria, but it was never fully rolled out, and right now it is not in use. And in fact, the decision whether it can be ever introduced currently lies with the Supreme Administrative Court, after the Austria Data Protection Agency has appealed an earlier court decision that was in favor of the system. And what was interesting there was that the Data Protection Agency not only criticized the data protection issues, but also the fact that there is no legal basis for such a profiling system in Austria, and also that this decision support system, so it's called a kind of semi-automated system. So the final decision lies with the caseworker, as we will see later. There is the risk that this semi-automated decision support system can be used as an automated system in practice, right? Because people oftentimes just take over a score instead of relying on their own experiences. So that's also an aspect we will get back later. Right now, the system is not in place. That is important here. So very briefly, what the system does, it is actually a system that draws on past statistics in order to classify job seekers into 3 groups, to which different resources for further education are allocated, basically. So it basically looks for connections between the job seekers' characteristics and the successful employment. And the main goal is to primarily invest in the middle group, which is the group of people that could make the best use of these funds, because those are the ones that can make use of it in terms of being reintegrated into the job market again. So the high group, sort of the best group can find a job anyway. That's the basic rationale. And the low group sort of cannot make use of the funds just because they won't be able to be reintegrated into the job market nevertheless. So there are sort of lost causes in this very basic rationale. So the most efficient use of the funds is the middle segment, and that's the one where the main investment is put into right now. So, and of course, it seems to be like a legitimate goal, but if we look at the system more closely, we can see several problems here. Florian, can you go back one slide again? Sorry. No, one more. Even one more, I guess. The study and methods, right?
Sorry, I was getting a little lost. I wasn't sure where you were.
As long as I don't say turn the slides, you just don't have to do anything. So what did we analyze here? So first of all, we had an oversight of publicly available documents from December 2017 until 2019. So in 2017, the first sort of concept paper, as it was called, by the company developing the system has been put out. The name of the company is Synthesis GmbH, and they put out a concept paper in order to be transparent. That is a very interesting fact in itself, because due to this concept paper, large criticism emerged quickly in the media due to discriminatory effects of the system. So that was sort of a huge a thing once they have put out this paper. But then there were also, of course, policy documents shaping the debate, and also reports and evaluations by oversight bodies, the so-called data inquiries by NGOs like Epicenter Works and others, who sort of asked and challenged the system or the AMS, and they answered them, and they put these documents online as well. So we got a lot of information from these data inquiries. So once they have put out this concept paper, all kinds of institutions and NGOs started to get more information about the system in order to be able to evaluate and discuss the system properly. So later on, we also did a data inquiry ourselves. So we also got in dialogue with the AMS itself. And we also met representatives from this company in order to better understand the system. So as you said, Katja, it's not so easy to study such a system because we never had real access to the system, of course, and also not the data they are using, of course, also due to data protection issues, for example. So this is a very interesting question here. So we always had to get at the system by all the information that we could get out of the system in a way by the Public Employment Service itself or by the published documents. And we did a qualitative analysis in the tradition of a constructionist research, which means that we sort of followed the algorithm in the making, but we also had a look at the institutional argumentations to legitimize its introduction, which was very important here. So why is it even necessary to have such a system? And also the roles and functions it should play in future counseling processes. So we treated these documents as social facts in the sense that we analyzed them for what they are, but also what they were used to accomplish. And of course, the context was very important here as well, because it's different whether it's a policy document or a data inquiry or a paper by the company itself. Now you can turn the slide, please, Florian. So as you can also read in this paper that I mentioned before in Katja's special issue with the title Algorithmic Profiling of Job Seekers in Austria, we sort of analyzed the system on basically 3 layers. So of course we had a look at the technology, at the system itself. But we also had a look at the way it is supposed to be introduced into the counseling process. So we analyzed also materials we got from the AMS in terms of how to educate case workers, how to use the system in practice, how to explain it to the job seeker and so forth. And last but not least, we also analyzed the broader context. So what is the relation between the profiling of job seekers and labor market policies, which was also one of the main goals, to see how these policies get embedded in the system as well. So to sum up, what we call the socio-technical analysis was really to see how the social sort of shapes the technical, how the technology is developed in this broader social political context, but also how the system feeds back on social practices and, yeah, society at large, basically. Yeah, as I mentioned before, we were a team of 5, yes, team of 5 researchers. So Doris Alhuter and I co-led the project we are both at the Institute of Technology Assessment, and then together with Florian Czech, Fabian Fischer, also from the Center for Informatics and Society at the Technical University, and Gabriel Trill from the School of Information from the University of Michigan. So we closely worked together in order to also see how these 2 aspects are interrelated. So also in our work practices, we try to not separate the social analysis from the technical analysis, but we really try to see how the 2 really shape the system in a way. So now, Florian, I give the floor to you because Florian will explain the system in more detail.
Thank you, Astrid. Well, you already gave essentially the basic surroundings of how the system was designed and what it was supposed to be doing. And in the one sentence, you summed it up perfectly. It's a classification system that is supposed to classify job seekers into these three categories. Those that are proclaimed to will have a high chance to find a job within 6 months, those with sort of mediocre prospects that are not part of either the group of those with high prospects or the group with low prospects, and finally, yes, this group that is projected to have a very low chance of reemployment within the next 2 years. The shaping of these three categories was one of the things that already got a lot of negative feedback and a lot of criticism when the first concept paper, as they called it, was published. One criticism that was quickly answered by the CEO of the Austrian Public Employment Service, Johannes Kopf, with the general argument that these more pessimistic outlooks that some of these people would be presented with would be just a factual presentation of the sort of harsh reality of the job market. And that was kind of the start of this whole discussion and the whole framing that the position that the AMS took on this, that yes, the system was giving the impression of discrimination because it was representing what was simply the reality. Among other things, in terms of this critical public reception, there were also a number of initiatives, not least by Epicenter Works, to do something about that system and to collect support for shutting it down or not making it happen, or at least not releasing it into the public beyond this sort of test period that we heard about before. You can see the link down here and the little graphic that they put on there if you want to take a closer look on that. Now, of course, as simple as that sounds, there's three groups. We still have to ask the question, well, how are they actually doing this? And more importantly, why are they trying to do this? In the documents that we analyzed, including the communication, the way that the public officials of the AMS presented their case as well, essentially there were three main objectives that they were supposedly after with this system. The much cited increase of efficiency of the counseling process. The clients that the AMS works with and the caseworkers that work there only have very little and limited time normally. The pressure on the AMS is very hard to make little resources work for a lot of people, and the idea here was to give them support to create a more smooth counseling process and use fewer human resources in the process. At the same time, in a different dimension, it was also geared towards the question of effectiveness of the use of funds. So as part of this counseling process, one of the responses and one of the results can be that the AMS funds and supports a job seeker with certain measures, which can include job training or other kind of courses as well, which of course cost money and thus are a strain on the resources of the AMS. And the stated goal of the system was also to increase the effectiveness of these measures, to make sure that the people that really need those measures get them and the people that do not meet those measures do not get them. And finally, the AMS also responded to pre-existing and long-standing criticism that the counseling process was governed by a certain level of human bias and arbitrariness in the decisions of who would get which kind of funding or which kind of support. That was a point of contention before, and their argument, of course, was the objectivity of such a system, or the proclaimed objectivity of such a system, would reduce this kind of bias and this kind of discrimination that would happen out of this. In the end, the idea is still that the support that the AMS is trying to give those clients is geared towards increasing their chances to get reintegrated into the labor market. From a policy point, they took the stance and said, we are aiming to spend our funds on the people with medium chances, the argument or the thinking behind that was the people who have high chances can make it on their own and don't need any additional support, and the people with low chances don't require this support because regardless of what we throw at them, they will never manage to actually get there. And the argument here was also a very sort of a business-focused approach of what's our return on investment if we invest funds and resources into these people. There are certain exceptions, though, that we should mention. For instance, there are laws that govern certain groups that are protected that still need to get certain funds or certain measures automatically, regardless of their actual chances on the labor market or their projected chances on the labor market, such as, for instance, young people who have a guarantee for education. So now, still the question stays from a bit more technical standpoint, what is this system actually? How does it arrive at this final decision? How does it lead to support? And then we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at whether or not it can actually reach those objectives and what the quality is of such an implementation and such an approach. So at the core of the system is a statistical profiling system. The prediction that it does try to make is to predict the chance of reintegration into the labor market based on past data, empiric evidence that they have collected over the last 4 years. This chance of reintegration is an actual percentage value from 0 to 100. Based on this chance, and at certain thresholds that we're going to look into a little bit later, the classification system then sorts these clients into 3 different categories, as I said, with high, medium, and low chances, and they do that based on their personal integration chance. As I said, the data that they work with is a set of empiric observations about the past cases that they've seen, that the AMS has seen within the last 4 years, and they are using a certain value of similarity to compare a new individual that would be sitting before a caseworker to other individuals that the AMS has seen in the past. And this similarity is an interesting point, of course, because there are various different ways, both technical and socio-technical, to determine what similarity could and should mean, and they chose a very specific and a very stringent approach to similarity, actually. They use a variety of different variables and attributes that are attached to their observations of human beings, of people, of job seekers, that include broadly 3 categories. There's personal data, such as age, gender, and care duty. There is the personal labor history, for instance, the number of days of gainful employment that these people had, and which measures they were granted as part of their history with the AMS. And then as the only contextual piece of data that is not directly connected to the person itself, at least at first glance, it's the performance of the regional office that they're assigned to in terms of how many people in this office are looking for a job, how many clients does this regional office have, and how many clients of those actually do find a job. Let's take a little bit of a closer look at how these variables actually work and how they're designed. So here's the complete list that we've been able to determine, as well as their possible values on the other end. So you can see that gender, for instance, is a very sort of naive and simple binary value. Then we have age groups. Here we have 3 possible values in these standard brackets. Similarly, nationality works for Austria, the European Union in general, or third countries, and so on and so forth. The regional labor market is the variable I just talked about before. This is the sort of the performance of the regional offices that a single person would be assigned to. And then there are some other variables that are not as clearly defined or not as easy to grasp. For instance, health impairments is a simple binary value of yes or no, with no further explanation what that actually is supposed to mean. Similarly, responsibility of care is also just a yes or no, can pertain, for instance, to children, but also the elderly. And on the same kind of level, the definition of a job sector is only split into 2 very broad categories of the production and the service sectors, and doesn't go any deeper. It gets a little bit more detailed when we're talking about the labor history. There are a total of 4 or rather 5 variables that try to encapsulate and formalize this particular attribute of a person, from the days of employment to the number of times this person was at the AMS because they were looking for a job within 4 years. And then they are looking at the length of the case as well and how many measures this person was granted or not granted. And then finally, the current milestone also plays a role. So of course, they're assuming that the data that they can get about people will tell them something different depending on where in their sort of case journey at the AMS they are, if they're standing at the very beginning and have just had their first meeting, or if they've been looking for a job already for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and so on until 48 months. So far, we've created a huge set of combinations of variables that, of course, can have all kinds of weird and combinations that may not be particularly obvious at first, but it opens up an incredibly large problem space for this whole thing. Now, the synthesis GmbH that designed the system then did a thing that they call stratification. They made it sound like that is a super standard approach to data science, which it absolutely isn't. But nonetheless, they're designing something that they're calling constellations. So if a single person gets looked at by the system, then all of these variables are assigned according to their attributes. And then you get a specific combination of these attributes. So here I've marked an example here that would be a person that is marked as male between 30 and 49, nationalities from an EU country, not from Austria, but also not from a third country. Their highest level of education was an apprenticeship, no health impairments, no responsibility of care, and so on and so forth. Now, that is what they call a constellation. And here we're coming back to this measure and approach to similarity that they're taking. They're basically saying, we are comparing you to all of the people that have exactly the same attribute assignments as you have. So a constellation with these attributes would include all people in the last 4 years that have exactly the same attributes. And that would be the mass of people that you would be compared to if you were sitting at the IMS and your labor market reintegration chance would be calculated. Now, how do we get to this IC score in detail? The one sentence definition is that the IC score is the ratio of members in this client's constellation group that have successfully reintegrated into the labor market versus those that have not. That sounds a little bit more complicated than it really is. In the end, it is an incredibly simple and sort of naive approach. Basically, you're just looking at the number of people that are in your group in the last 4 years, and then you're taking the ratio, how many have made it and how many have not. But of course, to measure that, you have to define a certain criterion. What's the criterion when you say you have been successfully reintegrated into the labor market or not? And here they're splitting it into these 2 different criteria. There's the long criterion and the short one. For the short one, to have made it by the definition of the AMS, you needed 90 days within 7 months of gainful employment. They don't have to be consecutively, but in total, you have to have at least 90 days of gainful employment within 7 months. And the long criteria would be 180 days in 2 years or 24 months. And now based on these 2 IC criteria, they're doing their assignment in the end. And this is where we come back to these thresholds that they've defined. So any person or any group, any person coming to the IMS gets compared to their constellation. And then we're seeing how many people manage to do this. First, they're going to look at the short criteria. If there's more than 66% of the people that have made this, then you are also given high chances. Then we look at long criteria. If less than 25% have made it according to this criteria, then you're given low chances. And if neither of those fit, then you're thrown into the group with the medium chances. Just to illustrate that a little bit more, I'm going to give another practical example. It's at first, again, a little bit hard to wrap your head around it. because of its simplicity, really. But with a concrete example, it's a little bit easier. So let's do a little bit of simple math here. This is the constellation I've shown before. Let's assume there are 50 people in the last 4 years that share their exact attributes with exactly the same values. And let's also assume that of those 50 people, 10 have fulfilled the integration criterion long. That means that 10 people of those 50 people have managed these 180 days of employment within 2 years. That would give us a nice C value of 10 divided by 50, which is 20%. And because 20% is lower than the threshold of 25%, your classification, or their classification in this case, would be low chances. It really is that simple. It's not much more than that. We have to admit that in the very first publication, the one that we published in the special issue edited by Katja as well, we were not entirely aware of that yet. That is a huge transparency issue that we're going to come back to a little bit later. The initial documents that they presented gave the impression that there was some kind of logistic regression going on by which they would be calculating these IC scores. And it took us a very long time and some very pointed questions and long emails back and forth to sort of pry it out of them that no, in the end, it really is just as simple as that. But nowhere in any of the documents we analyzed was that just written down as it is here. Not that simple, at least. So now, of course, the next question is, if a system is that simple, how well can it actually perform, even from a statistical, from a technical standpoint? And of course, we cannot verify any of these numbers, but we're basing them on the documents that we have and the documents and the data that they've given us. And within those documents, it's pretty clear that the correct classification sort of fluctuates between 65% and over 90%, depending on the subpopulation that we're talking about. If you're thinking about any kind of automated decision-making or prediction classification system out there in the machine learning world, anything above 75% sounds great, and anything about 85% sounds magical, and at 90% I'm personally getting suspicious that something weird is going on. So of course we also tried to take a little bit of a look at that, but you have to take a step back and think of course, the law of large numbers that's making this a little bit less well-performing than it might be on the first look, at least if you take a stance away from this purely technical look at that. So on average, the system is right about 85% of the time. If we're assuming a very, very conservative estimate of 500,000 clients every year that would be scored by the system, that 500,000 job seekers that go through the AMS process, and we definitely and certainly know that there are way more than that, at least right now because of COVID, then even with this conservative estimate of 500,000 clients, we would say that this means on average 75,000 people a year would be classified wrongly. A single little icon there represents 10,000 people in the little graphic that I've given here. So it's an important sort of illustration for the point that even a number that sounds fantastically high for other applications, for other machine learning systems, will still have a very real and palpable impact on a large number of people if you're scaling it up to the size of, say, a small state or a small country that is Austria. Now, while we're already talking about error rates, we have to kind of approach this question of quality a little bit. How do you determine whether or not a system like that is qualitatively okay or not? The system, of course, is being presented with these claims of objectivity and at the same time also with this excuse of, well, no system is perfect. And of course, there's going to be a certain set of errors happening there. And that kind of follows this big data analytics notion of a truthful representation of reality that is following an ideal that is nonetheless not an actual truthful representation of reality, of mechanistic objectivity, which of course isn't happening here either. But that is the claim that they are making about how well the system is performing and why it is performing so well. The only indicator of performance that the AMS and the synthesis GmbH themselves have presented ever were these precision values, these error values. That was the core thing that they were sort of circling around and comparing it to other systems, and this is such a great value. However, we'd like to posit that perhaps other measures of quality could be approached as well that may give you a better impression of what that system would actually do were it employed in the wild. So on the one hand, you have this precision as a sort of standard technical procedure. That's what you do when you create a machine learning system or any other statistical profiling system. You count true and false positives and try to gauge how often the system is right. But at the same time, significant value judgments moved and created this system and were implemented in the way that this is happening. So independent of the question of whether or not it is spitting out correct things within the frame that they've given, there are still some questions that should be asked about the values that are embodied by a system like that. Also important to mention here, an average of 85% does not necessarily mean that every person has an 85% chance of being judged correctly or getting a correct prediction. As we saw, a lot of these segments of subpopulations have way worse error rates, going down as far as 69%. So if you happen to be in a group that has not as high chance of being handed a correct prediction, then it may be that basically a third of the people get classified wrongly, roughly. And so, of course, these errors are also not distributed equally, as in this is not a wonderful like average Gauss curve that you can lay over all the people and then you land somewhere on there. Of course, there are issues as like cumulative disadvantage that mean that certain people, certain groups of subpopulations, people with background in migration, as they classify it, for instance, or women are judged or get a prediction that is wrong more often than others as well. Also because the system doesn't have as many comparisons available to them to make a prediction about them. Beyond the general question of precision and the way that we judge the quality of these systems, as we know, all of these systems can be skewed in different and complicated ways. And have certain biases. We're not moving as far as equating bias with discrimination outright, but of course there is a connection between the two. Discrimination as a legal term is a little bit more narrowly defined, and that's why we're sticking with bias here. We're using a bias framework coined by Nissenbaum in the 90s already that basically separates three different types of bias: technical bias, pre-existing bias, and I've skipped over the third one, but I'll get to it in a second when the next slide comes up. I want to just outline a little in these next few slides how these biases manifest within such a system. Starting with technical bias, there are certain decisions that were made when the system was designed that introduces bias automatically. For instance, they separate their subpopulations because they stumbled over the problem that they don't have a full set of data over 4 years for every single person that they come across or every single person that they're trying to look at within the last 4 years. So they take the whole population and separate out those that they have a complete employment history for 4 years, and then they are looking at the other ones that don't have a complete employment history. So far, that seems like a sound technical decision, but then there's a next step that really at first very much puzzled us, because they're taking the people that they have incomplete data about and they're further separating them in a stringent set of 3 decisions. First, they're taking all of the people who have the value migration background set and say, all right, these are a separate subgroup that we're looking at differently. Then there is the people that are under the age of 25. That's the second subgroup. And then only they're taking the rest of the people that don't have complete data either. Our suspicion, but we can't prove that, of course, is that they had to do that in order to reduce their error rates. That if they use the average of all the people with no data or limited data, then they would end up with way, way worse numbers in the end. And that's a bit of a way of statistical trickery to get away with that. But we can't really prove that. What we do know is that they have the subcategory for people under the age of 25, so people who may likely not have 4 years of employment history because they're simply too young. They've just finished their education or they're still in education, in order to also satisfy the legal requirement to give these people a chance at education. They will be treated differently regardless of the score that they get in the end. There are also other biases that are introduced by technical decisions made in the design of the system, such as the abstraction of the variables. There are hard thresholds in there, as we've seen, for instance, with the age group. It's exactly under the age of 30 or over the age of 30, which also means that, interestingly enough, if you take two people and one is 29 and the other person is 31, then they're in a separate group and get treated differently. But if you have a single person that's 31 and then another person that is 49, these people are treated the same way by the system. This introduces, of course, a huge amount of bias as well. And then they had to standardize and exclude certain variables and approaches because they're simply hard to model, or because they would explode the problem space massively if they included all the different subcategorizations. One of the other technical instances or technical biases that's really interesting is that there's a unfounded and also not really argued for assumption that the group that they're designing, this constellation, is by definition a homogeneous group. So they're saying if I am being compared to people who have the same attributes as me, then implicitly these people must be the same as me because they have had the same chances or the same likelihood to get a job as me. That is not really founded in anything. There are plenty of examples of groups that you could design where there's absolutely no homogeneity at all. And it also leads to the question of, well, what's the statistical significance of comparing people to me if there's only a very small amount of observations? And we've seen in our analysis that there's a huge swath of numbers of people, about 39% of all job seekers, for whom there are only 50 other people that have the same attributes or even less. There are even people or groups of people that have less than 10 comparisons, which the synthesis game AHA themselves sort of admits that's not statistically sound. And in this case, the system automatically merges constellations. So it disregards certain variables. For instance, they could, for a certain group of people, for a certain constellation, simply ignore the gender variable and then combine the two adjacent fields in the matrix and say, all right, we're going to look at those because then we get more than 10 comparisons or more than 50 comparisons. But of course, we don't know how they're making the choice, which variables to disregard. That was never defined anywhere. And also at a certain point, if you disregard more and more variables, it becomes about as precise as throwing a dart at a dartboard. And the statistical relevance of making these kind of constellations happen is becoming really irrelevant. And then finally, I've mentioned it before already, there is technical bias embedded within the system because of the discrepancies in the error rates between the different subpopulations and constellations. And that also leads to cumulative disadvantage. The two other types of bias are, of course, emergent bias. That's the one that hated me before, probably because COVID is so in my face that it then becomes invisible. Whenever you implement a system, you implement it for a certain amount of time, and then it will run for a certain amount of time, and it's hard to change these systems fundamentally. Because of that, there may be external factors that change that you were not able to take into consideration when you designed the system. That may be something like a change in social values in the context of the application. For instance, by now, the state of Austria recognizes a third gender option. The system does not. And then you have other impacts like extraordinary events, for instance, the recession in 2008, or more recent, as I said, COVID-19. COVID-19 in particular is interesting because from a profiling point of view, the data that they're looking at and they've been looking at for the last 2 years is completely and utterly worthless. If you're assuming that you can predict the chances of reintegration into the labor market based on your observations of the past, then you need some kind of continuity in your data. Right now, you have a complete break in the February, March of 2020 when suddenly everything changed and a job or a person working, for instance, in the gastronomy would suddenly not find a job anymore, whereas before that may have been very easy for them. So the predictive value of all of these variables has to be called into question massively. And then, of course, You have other impacts as well, like legislative changes or sort of localized changes, like a bankruptcy of a very large company that may massively impact how valid your data is still that you're building upon for a certain case. Finally, pre-existing bias. We've touched upon this in the very beginning already. Of course, the system represents an almost mirror image of the degree of inequality that we have in the labor market as it is. It manifests this structurally unequal treatment and cements this historically long-lasting and cumulative disadvantage for certain groups and their overlaps as well. And yes, we could also point out that marginalized groups systematically get these lower IC values as well. Then, of course, also the use of these personal variables that are connected and correlated with disadvantage to begin with is also highly problematic and introduces this kind of pre-existing biases as well. So, looking at that, I think we can move back to Astrid and take a bit closer look at how the system is actually being used in practice beyond the purely technical parts.
Exactly. So what is it done with in the practice? So as I said before, we also analyzed how the AMS tried to train caseworkers how to use the system, giving them guidelines and also Q&As with very specific answers, how they should explain the system to the caseworkers, given to the job seekers, given that, of course, caseworkers are not all mathematicians or informatics people, and obviously they also don't understand the system in detail. So they have pre-formulations how to explain the system, for example, to the job seekers. So also for in these materials, they define these 3 goals. They also explain to the caseworkers. So first of all, the system should, go beyond human prejudices and turn away from this arbitrariness towards modernization by using the existing database. So this is staged as state of the art in a way. It should increase the efficiency of the counseling process, especially distribution of funds, by effectively investing in the middle segment, as we said before. And then it's called, or it's framed as a second opinion. So the ultimate responsibility remains with the caseworker. And this is a very important point in practice. So even though it is framed as a second opinion, as I said before, there is a certain incentive to follow the score instead of counteracting the score, as we will see in a minute. And this is relevant for larger policy discussions we will see towards the end. So this is, Florian, again, please turn the slide. This is how the interface looks. So the caseworker sees next to all the other information he or she has about a person, sees this score, the IC score. And in the left upper corner, we can see here the CAM-N, which is the lowest group. The N stands for the niedrig, the lowest group. And so we can see here the short-term prospects are only 13% here, and the long-term prospects are only 10%. So it's a very low score. This caseworker in this case decides to move this person to the middle segment. So this is the BAM-M you can see below. It stands for the middle segment. And if a caseworker changes or reclassifies the client, there needs to be a reason, right? There needs to be an explanation why he or she thinks the person should be reclassified. And there are also reasons detailed by the AMS itself. So, for example, there are criteria that have not been taken into account by the score, or other things have changed in the meanwhile, or things like that. So the person then the caseworker needs to write down why this person moved upwards or downwards to another segment. So here, for example, Ms. Grasberg is healthy, young, and has no care responsibilities, and she is looking for a job in the gastronomy and has great many options of jobs. Again, this is something that they learned from pre-COVID times, because obviously now if you're in a city, there's not that many jobs to choose from. If you're in gastronomy or in tourism, for example, city tourism is dead by now almost. So here we can already see that this data is problematic in terms of the current developments. So this is the interface. On the next slide, we see, On the next slide, we see the 3 types of factors that can legitimize, legitimize the reasons why you can change the person to another segment. So, for example, if factors like motivation have not been taken into account, or existing or missing qualifications that are not recorded in the system, or other things. Second category is changes while the client was unemployed. So, for example, care obligations have been taken care of in the meanwhile, or also the regional mobility improved or also worsened. Health restrictions changed, periods of employment abroad, and so forth. And the third type is the integration chances improved due to funding. So can the use of funding improve the labor market integration? So these are the 3 legitimate reasons why you can move a person to another category. On the next slide, we see here, for example, how this could look like. So here again, we see, first of all, the person was classified as in the middle segment. That is the thing you can see below. The explanation given, and these are also pre-formulated sentences. Not every person gets personalized sentences why they have been moved, but rather standardized sort of phrases. So in this case, the explanation is: you have been employed over a very long period during the past 2 years. You have not completed any professional training beyond compulsory school level. And as the time passes and the client hasn't found work yet, the score then changes to low. This is the one on the upper end of the slide. And here the explanation is: you have not completed any professional training beyond compulsory school level. The qualifications you have acquired are of little value on the job market. So we can see here that the reasons for lowering the job chance lies with the client and not, for example, with the economy. So there could also be external factors, right? So why the person doesn't find a job, but it's sort of essentialized by referring to the characteristics of the person. Next slide, please. So what we can see here is that AMS is framed as the second opinion, and the caseworker is seen also as a social corrective, which is interesting because oftentimes they recur to the objectivity and the neutrality of the score, and at the same time the human in the loop should be the social corrective in a way, and making sure that the right decision is made, and should also improve the decision in case the algorithm is wrong, which is hard to assess for a caseworker that is not a mathematician, for example. So we see some kind of troubles here already. So another issue is that the support of the caseworker, so the score should support the caseworker, but at the same time it undermines the caseworker's own experiences, right? So oftentimes people have been in this job for 20, 30 years, they've gained experiences about people, so they are torn between this mathematic IC score they are seeing now and their own assessment of the person, for example. So the caseworkers may find themselves torn between different things. So following the algorithmic suggestion on the one hand, but also overruling the algorithm on the other. So there is a certain incentive, of course, to follow the score because it's less work. So as we have seen before, if you always have to find an explanation why you move a person to a different segment, it's more work because you have to come up with a reason to have to write it down and so forth. You maybe also have to defend it if your boss asks why you change so many people, for example, ultimately. So in Vienna, the counseling time is 10 minutes oftentimes, so we can realize that oftentimes it's easier to just follow the score instead of writing all these explanations. And then there is also a certain tension between the bias that may contradict experiences and the fostering of human prejudices. So both is at work here as well. And then the legal implications, we will also come back to that issue at the very end. So the semi-automated decision-making system escapes this GDPR and Equal Treatment Act also, since it's not fully automated. And that is also something that has been debated in larger political for example, the German Data Ethics Commission also argued that semi-automated decision systems, as I said at the beginning, also the Data Protection Agency had a similar argument that semi-automated decision-making systems could figure as automated systems in practice. So if we realize that all the caseworkers, for example, just follow the score in order to speed up the counseling process, that is also one of the main aims of the system. We could see that in practice it is treated as an automated system. So it would be troubling if it escapes a regulation, while in fact it's doing the same in a way. Next slide, please. I'm speeding up a bit so that we have good time for discussion as well. So another important aspect is that a complex biography and skills are reduced to a seemingly objective value. So, and that changes the whole counseling process. So once you have this score, it's more than additional information that the AMS always argues. So Johannes Kopf always in these interviews said, well, it's just one additional information, right? But it's not, it's really changing the whole counseling process. Because once you have the score and you have to change the segment and find this explanation and so forth, you're always working along the system already during this counseling process. And you're not starting from the biography of the person or the needs of the person, but you're sort of structured by the system, and your job is broken down into these tasks you have to fulfill all of a sudden. Also, the employability is framed as being largely tied to the individual, as we also saw already. The limited agency to change the classification due to choice of variables is also a danger of stigmatization of different groups. I think Florian has hinted at that. What is going on now? And the claims of the quality through the precision stands against the value-laden selection of the variables, categories, thresholds, and performance indicators, right? So there is already these kind of values that went into the system. So the question really is, and now we could go back to the very first slide that Florian presented, is the AMS meeting the organizational goals at all? And here it's interesting that the increase in the efficiency, for example, which was one of the goals of the consulting process, can only be reached, in fact, with the predominantly routine adoption of the IC score. So you can only speed up the process if you follow the score. If you really follow the rules and guidelines and explain the score to the job seeker and so forth, you will take even more time to explain all these things. And this counteracts the service orientation of an institution as well that fulfills its public mandate to increase the chances of the job seekers. So this is something that doesn't go together, right? On the one hand, you should follow the score. On the other hand, that goes against its actual mandate. Increasing the training efficiency and effectiveness by concentrating the funding in the middle segment does not aim at the accuracy and quality of measure for a client, but it combines the goal of the effective use of resources with the course division into three customer groups. And the standardization to reduce the arbitrariness also goes against the fact that in the development of the system, hardly any procedures were used to avoid bias, and the system does not offer assistance with preventing possible structural unequal treatment. So traditionally, equal treatment plays a role in the job agency's practice. So even before the system, there were measures in place to really go against these injustices. And now the risk is that the system is overrolling the AMS own goal of going against, for example, the funding, extra funding for women or also migrants and so forth. So it goes against its own goal with the system partly. Under this presumed objectification impetus. So on a larger scale, we could see here that this is part of this neoliberal shift. Also, we can see here, right, from the transformation of the welfare state toward a workfare state, and this is something that goes beyond Austria. This is something we could see over the past 20 years all over Europe. And now, in order to receive welfare support, you have to prove the employability. So it's based on the principles of efficiency and effectiveness rather than on a principle of solidarity, which is actually the main point in having public insurance and which is actually which it actually has been based on. And this is different in Sweden, for example, where Sweden invests. So we could take the same system, right? And if you would invest in the group 3, in the lower chances group, there would be a whole different outcome. So in Sweden, for example, they give the most funds into the segment 3. So it's a political decision to invest in the segment B to increase the efficiency. And maybe we should quickly move, Florian, to the scenario now, because what we did in the end was to sort of illustrate the arguments with a specific scenario. So it's fictitious. It's not a real person we are having here, but it's a person that we made up in order to illustrate how the variables and the mathematics and the social practice go together and what it does in practice. And I think we should quickly go through this scenario because it's better to understand the whole system in a way. So should I say the story quickly? So what she is?
Sure, yeah.
Go into the variables.
Sure, I'm gonna hide it again.
Yes, hide it again, please. So Ms. Shifte A is an Iranian citizen who migrated to Vienna 3 years ago to complete her master's degree in computer science at the Technical University of Vienna. During this time, she was a student assistant. After completing her studies and ending her employment, she is now registered as unemployed and she is looking for a job in the IT industry. Her actual prospects are excellent. The highest segment H. She speaks German on a B1 level. Her English and Farsi are excellent, and English communication is standard in most of the larger IT companies. She is highly motivated, does not expect any problems finding a job, and has potential positions on her application list. So now we can see what the algorithm does with her by reducing this complex biography to this very rough categories of variables.
Yeah. So, of course, she's classified as female. She is classified in the education bracket of high school graduate plus, because that is the highest level that the algorithm knows. Anything above, including a bachelor's, a master's, PhD, habilitation, doesn't play any role anymore. It's all in the same group. She is classified as a person that comes from a third country, not the European Union or not from Austria. Because she was living and on a student assistant salary for a long time, she couldn't afford a expensive flat in an expensive location. So she was living in the 10th district, which has the RGS type, the regional type of 5, which is the worst one, because the regional office there isn't performing very well. A lot of people are looking for jobs and not many are finding any. She's also classified as in the service industry, which generally is not looked at as favorably as the production sector as well. And she's assigned to the population of those with partially valid data, because she only has been in Austria for 3 years. She only finished her master's here, and she did so in record time. So she hasn't been here the full 4 years, and thus the system says, I don't know you completely. I don't know 4 years of data about you. And of course, because she has a migration background, she's also classified in there. And that ends up giving her a hypothetical IC value of 22%, and she's assigned to the low segment. The assumption here would be, if you look at the constellation, as they call it, that we've collected here, a lot of the other people, a lot of the other women that may be in this same group may not be, for instance, highly educated or in the tech sector at all. But the system is too coarse; it cannot distinguish between these people. And now we're trying to illustrate how a scenario would go when this person actually ended up going to the AMS, looking for her job, and what happens next. Astrid, do you want to go through this, or should I just continue?
Move on a bit. So here we can see a great discrepancy between the job seeker and the caseworker, right? The counselor. So the client actually expects good chances and plans to respond to job offers. After being, that's the second one. So I start with the counselor. It makes more sense from the text. So the counselor gets this IC value and compares it to the biography, right? She does not get any explanatory text displayed because she does not have the full history. So that's another thing that is very complicated, but not all of these job seekers have the explanations why they are categorized the way they are categorized. So there are no explanations. Based on the education, though, and the sector, the client is upgraded, but the system does only suggest to upgrade like one segment, right? So it suggests to upgrade her to the middle class. So after the upgrade, she gets various training options, and the idea is to start a course as usual. The client is very puzzled though, because she doesn't expect any good chance. She expects good chances and doesn't expect any problems to find a job, and she plans to respond to job offers already. After being classified as low and upgraded, she has doubts, but she has to accept the course after all. So we see here is a huge discrepancy between the real biography and the counseling process that is very much guided by the score. So if there were no score, maybe the caseworker would have come up with a very different picture right from the beginning. So now she already has to almost work against the system in order to upgrade the person. So the result of the operational implementation is the upgrade from low to medium, but it's also a demotivation of the client that didn't expect any things like that. And she has to do additional training, and she thinks additional training is necessary, apparently. That it delays the job applications due to the increased contact intervals and course. So now she is put in a system that she might not even need. So that very much goes against the initial goal of the AMS, right? To make it more efficient and to place the funds in the right place. Would you like to go on with the technical bias, Florian?
Sure. I mean, I think you've already summed it up pretty completely in this regard. Anyways, it's pretty obvious what's happening here. So the system is significantly underestimating the potential chances of this client because of the way that the variables are modeled, and because they simply cannot represent the reality of this person's job prospects. She's possibly being compared with people of a completely different background. So that goes against this assumption of heterogeneity within a constellation that clearly isn't the case here. And she's also assigned to this subpopulation with partially valid data that generally is assumed to have worse chances on the labor market, because the implicit assumption is something must be wrong with you if you don't have a complete history of labor inclusion in the labor market. And so the question is then, of course, with all of these biases in place, is there any chance that the system can actually reach these objectives that the IMS has been being put forward? And I think, as we've both outlined so far, this is a really great illustration of how the system would absolutely fail all of these objectives, at least in this particular case. And I think the main argument that we're making is that a case like this, as specific and as hypothetical as it is not implausible at all. And there may be quite a few of those cases if you play around with these variables that follow essentially a similar script, as in the reality of a person's actual situation cannot be modeled with these very abstract and very sort of reduced variables.
So I'm looking at my watch right now. We have only 20 minutes left, so I think we should go through the remaining slides. I don't know, a bit faster maybe.
All right, I'll take less than a minute for this one. So one of the things that I work on, of course, is the question of accountability processes in algorithmic systems like that. And shameless self-promotion, you can read up all of this in a new paper that I just got published 2 weeks ago, where I'm essentially trying to take a look at what accountability processes could look like in this particular case and in another case as well. And I'm sort of building on this definition of accountability as this relationship between an actor and a forum, where the actor has the obligation to explain and justify their actions, their conduct, and then the forum can ask certain questions and pass judgment, and there may be even consequences for the actor. And you separate this into two different types of accountability, either micro accountability or macro accountability. I was more interested in the question of micro accountability, as in, what happens if you as the job seeker really sit there and you feel like that there is something going on that's wrong and you want to hold the system and the caseworker in front of you accountable. What is the option? What can you actually do with a system that is in place like this? And the analysis that I've done here is to try and look at it through the lens of agency and use that as a framing device. What are the possible actions that you can take in a situation like this? And as we can see, the actions, the agency that you have is severely limited by the way that the interaction is designed between you and the client, and as well between the system and you. You have very little chances of impact, and there's also very little chance for you to actually impose any kind of consequences, even if you strongly suspect that you've been wrongly categorized here. And the question of macro accountability is an interesting one as well. I would argue that we, as the research team that has been doing this, and the general public are sort of part of this accountability process as a larger forum, and even what we're doing here in this kind of course and the discussion that will follow is also a type of accountability, but that also faces some really stark challenges because of the lack of transparency and the contradicting information that we got from the people that put out the system, as well as this sort of hesitancy in disclosing this information, if we're being generous in describing it. And of course, the lack of access to the actual data didn't make this any easier either. So that leads us to the question, what do we do about this? We have a certain set of points, I think, that are something that should be considered, at least for cases like this. Of course, there needs to be system transparency, but there also needs to be data transparency, and in order to be able to actually make a judgment call about this. Explainability of these decisions and the micro accountability that I was talking about just before needs to be improved to an improved agency of all stakeholders that are involved with this, and that is only possible if you do this with a human-centered design approach, as we well know from the sort of HCI side of the sciences of computer science. There should be some kind of right of inspection and of objection too, and there needs to be some kind of critical knowledge transfer to the people who are affected by a system like this. And then in the end, we should all consider, is it really necessary to find another technical solution for a social problem? Maybe there may be a non-technical solution that addresses the issue way better than that. I think the other points we've already sort of made. Institutional level governance is also an interesting point, but that leads us a little bit further away now from the general points that we've been making. So I think it's time to move on to some more concrete recommendations that we've tried to make. Do you want to keep going, Astrid, or?
Just my paper. I can have different slides on my paper. So
that's all right.
5 slides, right? Or is it the last one?
Second to last, I think. So, of course, when we say transparency as a recommendation, it needs to be early, because if the system's already implemented and then it's published how it works, it's simply too late to change anything in many cases. It needs to be understandable, not just for a very small subset of technical experts or social science experts that can analyze it, but it needs to be more understandable for the general public as well. And it needs to be comprehensive. It's not okay to just say, publish tidbits here and there to make it sound good, and then as soon as you look a little bit deeper, you run into the wall and realize there's nothing you can actually glean from that. Again, the agency of clients to demand this kind of justification for why they're being treated the way that they are is something that needs to be enshrined both in accountability processes within the interactions with the system and also within the larger legal frameworks, but we can have a look at that still at the very end. And then again, this question, is it really the right idea to throw technology at this particular social problem, or are there other non-technological solutions that may already have been proven to be effective, like for instance, to increase the number of staff members, the number of caseworkers, to also reach the same goals, particularly when it comes to efficiency and effectiveness. And in the end, it's important to give both the employees and the customers sort of the chance to act, even if technical developments change. So if the system gets adapted further, if we throw different new kinds of technology, machine learning, AI, I'm sure at some point somebody's going to have the grand idea that this needs a blockchain for whatever reason, at a certain point, we need to preserve the ability to do something about that and to interact with these new changing environments for everyone that's involved as well. And finally, a system like that has risks, significant and clear risks, need to be addressed as such as well, in particular when it comes to discrimination, and take some kind of precaution against these quasi-automated decisions and the meaningless interaction, meaningless human-in-the-loop interactions if there's just rubber stamping of like every decision that the system makes. And that will require a new legal framework and some kind of auditing system as well.
So I think the last two slides are more on a broader level and will actually bring us to larger discussions around the AI Act and so forth. So I'm very quickly going through that because we are indeed running a bit out of time. So what's important here is an assessment of planned semi and automated decision-making systems. And there needs to be processes for external evaluation, right? So right now, we started from scratch, as it seems, but the more and more of the systems that are entering, especially public institutions, the more we need professional processes in institutions as well that could make audits and so forth, and not draw on an NGO that does it for free, right? So that is really problematic. The same happened with the Stop Corona app, for example. There should be information for the public. We said that before, public consultations and so forth. Maybe the next slide, Florian. And an even more larger governance level that requires really new processes and institutions that develop standardized procedures for that, so that not every system and every institution has to start from scratch, right? We need independent monitoring, auditing, evaluation of these algorithmic systems, supervisory bodies, and also, of course, other expertise, technical and legal expertise from civil society should, for example, also be integrated because they have a lot of knowledge and know-how and experience with auditing these systems. So again, here we don't have to start from scratch, but it needs to be professionalized and it also needs to be funded, right? And also affected individuals should get the chance or mechanisms and also appropriate procedures to challenge inadequate classifications, for example. Also, there needs to be processes for that as an individual. What can you do about it if you think you are wrongly classified, for example, as a job seeker? And that brings us to these broader framework conditions that are pretty interesting, right? So there is this one ethics approach on the one hand, where you, the German federal government, for example, installed this Data Ethics Commission. They also came out with a report saying the distinction between automated and semi-automated systems is problematic, for example. Then there are reports by NGOs, for example, by EDRI, European Digital Rights Initiative, saying, well, is then de-biasing really the solution, or is it yet again a technical solution for larger societal problems here? They are, for example, including in promoting technical de-biasing as the main solution to AI-driven structural inequality. We risk vastly underestimating the scale of the social, economic, and political problems AI systems can inflict. So that is also very interesting to think about, right? So could it be, could de-biasing also be framed as a technical fix for larger problems here? And of course, the AI Act that is currently debated, that has just been put out by the European Commission, for example, in April this year, and that will be the new legal act. And it's really important to see how hard it is to regulate these technologies in a technology neutral way. So what they're trying to do now is really to formulate, find a definition what AI even includes. And if we think about it from this perspective, about the AMS algorithm, for example, we already see that it is very hard to come up with a regulation, and even there thousands of standpoints and positions have been made by various actors, and it's going to be a really interesting process. So yeah, but I think we should leave that for the discussion, right, Florian?
Yes, I think so too. Apologies for going a little over there.
It was much longer than before.